Welcome to Rejected Religion Spotlight. I'm Stephanie Shea. My guest today is Sue Terry, and I'd like to welcome you, Sue, to Spotlight.
Hello, Stephanie. It's marvelous to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. If you'll allow me to give a brief introduction for the audience.
Of course, of course.
Sue Terry has an MA from the University of Surrey, where her dissertation was called The Magician Goes Further, the Occult Oblique View in the Short Fiction of Mary Butts. Sue is now a PhD candidate at Surrey, researching feminist occult modernist novels of the 20th century, and she's teaching open access courses in literature and the weird through her new venture, Owl House Seminars, and we'll be talking about this in more detail later on. Sue co-founded the Magickal Women Conference in 2018, and after almost 5 successful years as director, she stepped down in January of this year, which is very recent, in order to focus on her doctoral research on the Owl House Seminars and writing on the fiction of Alan Garner, which is destined to become a book. She is also the former editorial assistant for Correspondence Journal from 2018 to 2019. So it's very nice to have the chance to talk with you about your work, Sue. As I mentioned in the introduction, you co-founded the Magickal Women Conference. Would you share a bit about your time and work with the Magickal Women, the goals of the platform, as well as some of the speakers and events that you organized?
Yes, it would be my pleasure, Stephanie. Thank you. Well, it's as so much in my life, it started with a bit of a joke because I've been interested, obviously, in this field for a long, long time. So I make it my business to keep up with different kind of conferences and so on in the field. And now I can't remember the venue, and I probably would spare their blushes if I could. But a fair few years ago now, must have been about 5 or 6 years ago, there was an event that was going around from a university who were hosting something on the divine feminine. And I saw this come up, and I noticed that every speaker that I saw was a man. So I made a little comment on Facebook, goodness me, it's great to hear that men are all over the divine feminine. Really we ought to do something about that. And that garnered quite a lot of response from people. And I was so pleased because people like the joke, but B, it brought me into contact with Elizabeth Bartold, who's the owner of Hadean Press, and she contacted me offline and said, "Oh my goodness me, we really got to do something about this, haven't we?" And I said, "Yep, you took the words right out of my head, because I know we need to do something about this and put on a conference which actually features and centres women's experience of the divine feminine and what women are up to in this sphere." So it's not the first time in my life my sense of humour has got me into trouble, because then we started working together, and as you said, we worked together for nearly 5 years to present the whole of the Magickal Women event. Well, what it really showed me was that I'd identified that there was a real gap in women's presence in the public discourse in this field. And there was I'm aware of so many different strands being researched and practiced and celebrated right across all different spheres, arts being made beautiful, works, books written, etc. But, women just didn't have as much visibility as I knew they really should for their contribution. I mean, historically, say 20 odd years ago, the end of the 1990s, the 2000s, there were some marvellous conferences in London run by the Fellowship of Isis. Caroline Wise put them on, goddess events, and they ran for a few years and were incredibly popular. But then as those came to the end of their natural course, what I observed was that not every event that one went to was equally 50-50, shall we say, and it's very often that men were in the ascendant, shall we say, or tended to dominate these events. So I was really aware that the women's voice was not being heard. and Erzsebet obviously had very similar thoughts. So yes, time for women to be centered in this, the divine feminine, the goddess, and just the range of what women were up to. And we wanted to honor those women who'd gone before us in the fields of esotericism, the occult, the alternative spirituality, and scholarship. You know, everyone from sort of Helena Blavatsky to Jane Harrison to, you know, you name it, Mary Butts, whom we've just spoken of, and women who have always been there behind the scenes. For example, women in the Renaissance working with grimoires, women alchemists, and the whole strand of women who were so instrumental in bringing theosophy forward and spiritualism. These big movements which really, you know, continue to reverberate now in the 21st century. You know, we've got a massive span of time. So, you know, we were learning very fast that there's this massive pent-up demand from women to actually have something that centered them. And so Erzsebet and I got together and we started putting out a little bit of a tentative teaser on social media. And, you know, every time we thought, right, well, okay, that's it then. We've got the number. We'll probably get about, I don't know, 30 people in a room to talk about this. And maybe we might get like a normal conference. If we really pushed it, perhaps we might get more than sort of 8 speakers, because we could easily get that from people we know right now. But we might be able to get as many as 15. And anyway, as is now almost well-known history, we were completely and utterly overwhelmed by the response that we received. Wonderful. We were having a conversation on a Skype call. It's even before Zoom, for heaven's sake. You know, practically the dark ages of this sort of thing. And we were having a Zoom call one morning, and we were so excited, saying, oh, gosh, you know, we've got these people. It looks like we're going to have more than 15 speakers. How wonderful. Erzsebet's husband was listening in on the other line, as it were, in the other room, and he was on Facebook, and he suddenly said, oh, heavens, America's just woken up. They've all just come online. Oh, gosh. And at that moment, we looked at each other and thought, what is happening here? And honestly, this just followed a tsunami of papers and suggestions and everything from women all over the world, literally. So, you know, what we thought was going to be quite a small and discreet and lovely afternoon and all the rest of it, suddenly we were aware of the size of this. And we ended up choosing 40 speakers at this event. Wow. And honestly, Stephanie, we could have doubled that. We had so many calls, so many responses across every domain we can think of. And we knew we'd really hit on something at that point, because we had contact literally from the sort of north of Scotland down to the Channel Islands, because we ended up, you know, Dolores Ashcroft-Nowicki, who was living in Jersey, as our keynote speaker, which was marvelous. But more than that, we had speakers from all over America, from Europe, Italy, and Australia. Women wanted to join us from Australia, which was fantastic. And you know, we ended up hosting nearly 300 people in the room in London. So we knew that there was so much interest there that it really is something that was well worthwhile us doing, if you will. So what I always wanted to get out of Magickal Women to create here was an innovative, interdisciplinary platform for women, academics, researchers, independent researchers, writers and teachers, in arts and humanities across, as I said, all domains, the esoteric field. And also to develop a wonderful, supportive and friendly international community, which, heavens, we certainly did. So part of that really was helped by something that was really very horrible, because lockdown emerged after we'd had the fantastic conference in 2019. And we were planning a second conference for 2020. Everything was set up. Then, of course, the hammer came down, and we all know where we were. Mm. At that point, when things were getting quite desperate, really, in many ways, I suddenly thought, well, what are we going to do now? We've started something. We know that the response to the second conference was going to equally be so brilliant. And then I thought, well, what would perhaps be worth trying is a series of salons. I thought if we could bring people together once a week and share the speakers who we would have featured regularly in the real world, if you will, if we featured them regularly once a week, then we'll see how that goes. And heavens, that was just such a fantastic success. It was the Magickal Women's Summer Salons, which we held on a Sunday evening. We hosted 2 speakers a week, and we ran the program for, I think it was 10 weeks, 9 or 10 weeks, and we did that for 2 years. And goodness me, that was so wonderful, because it allowed women everywhere to become part of it. And I mean, men were part of it too, I have to say, but predominantly we did find that our audience was drawn from women, and some of them in quite difficult circumstances. So I can always remember a woman who contacted us, she was living in Tennessee, and she said, I'm the only woman who likes this sort of thing for sort of 50 miles around from where I live, and it's quite difficult for me to find friendship and so on this way. So it's so lovely to know that you're there. And of course we have other women who had tearing responsibilities through the week, and everyone was trying to navigate this really difficult time. And hosting women speakers who had so much to offer actually was very helpful. We started our program with Carrie Kirkpatrick, who was doing a sort of ritual around the healing goddesses and spirits which she brought to the space, and everyone was really responding so well to that, because they said that's just what we felt we needed at the time. And of course the program was more of the sort of magical women program generally, so we had academics talking about various aspects of, grimoire history and so on, as I've indicated, and artists talking about art that they produced, or historical figures from magical art and so on. So we had a really wide range of subjects. So that we made very much a virtue out of a necessity in that part, but it kept us really engaged with our audience, and allowed us then also to carry on with all our other conferences online that we had, and our events, such as the symposium on Margaret Murray, and we had the Into the Dark nights, which was sort of folklore of the autumn, great ghost stories and good traditions from all around the place. I remember one of our speakers, Lynn Thurman, brought us something about zombies, which was really a very interesting. Oh, wow. Great. And we had marvellous stories of people's engagement with ghosts. Elizabeth told us a fantastic story from her own family life. And we had other traditions that were being shared as well about sort of Halloween and so on. And what else did we do? One of the best events we did online was Ancient Magic. Now, this was bringing together, I think we had about 6 or 7 speakers for that, women who are engaged with real ancient magic from Sumer, ancient Egypt, and the magical papyri, and who actually are working it or doing particular studies. And I was sort of quite a bit of a funny story or association with this, because before we started Magickal Women, I attended a conference at the University of London, which was about ancient magic. And we had the audience there, I would say, was probably 70% academics. We're looking at the different types of magic from the ancient world. And there were, let's say 30% of people whom I realised had general interests in the subject, insofar as they're actual magicians or witches and people who had a general interest. So it was a nicely mixed audience. And one of the speakers gave a very interesting talk about the Greek magical papyri, at the end of which one of the questions from the floor was, do we know whether or not this actually worked? And I looked round the audience to the side where all my magical colleagues were and looked at them. I thought, who's going to be the first person to say this is what Crowley drew on for the Bournemouth, right? They've been working it for years. So when we did Ancient Magic, obviously we were open to women who were working it and doing it for themselves. And we had a marvelous session with Alison Tchaikovsky from New York, who works and creates magical talismans, and she used the Bournemouth ritual, the headless rite, from from the papyri to actually craft a talisman that we're all doing, at home. You can try this one at home, as you said. So that was really great. So there was a real blending there of sort of doing it yourself, plus having some sort of real top drawer discussion from an academic perspective of these ancient texts. So that was a really exciting conference we were able to do online, and it was very much symptomatic of the way we developed them. Engagement, wide range of offerings, and also wherever possible having people to try things themselves. So it's actually a learning process as well as just a sort of appreciating other people's academic research. And whenever we ever do anything live, whenever we were doing anything live, and I was always really keen that we had a nice, comforting, welcoming space, and that the community could really get on and make those connections happen. And I was really pleased to note that as a result of it, a lot of other things have happened too. In terms of kind of the numbers and the effect that it's had, I really think it was quite amazing, because I was really proud that over time I introduced something like 200, well, more than 200 expert women sessions. We hosted, 2,000, well over 2,000 attendees in total. I mean, really huge amounts of people. And we had over 20 international events, these are online and in real world ones. We had to provide lunch for people when they're there, a nice souvenir program. I show you this now. Fabulous program full of all the juicy materials. And we produced one amazing book, still available, folks, if you have yet to have the experience, as a result of something that's tangible that people could take away and be part of. And, of course, our raffle was legendary. So it was great fun for me to draw that. And over time also, what we really learned, how you get $1 million from a Magickal Women's Conference, from hosting a Magickal Women Conference. Really, in order to get $1 million, all you have to do is to start with 2 million. Because everything we did was purely on our own means, okay? And we had some wonderful sponsorship from book publishers and very small traders, but we weren't part of a university. We didn't get any free rooms or subsidies, resources, or anything like that. We've not had any. There's no secret millions behind us, as it were. All this kind of stuff. It was the sheer determination and the enthusiasm of the audience and the ability to sort of put their hand in the pocket to help us, to help them, to buy the tickets, to come along and put our own cash on the table as well. And I have to say the payoff that we received from that was just immense, because it was the enthusiasm and appreciation of the women and the whole audience who attended the events, and they shared our news and sent us messages and so on. I know it's from what people say to you that you realise the impact that you've had. And both Usbet and I, and latterly Lucy, were so knocked over by the fact that women would often come up to us and say, thank you for doing this. This is what we've been waiting for a long time. Or afterwards, I can see the legacy that we have. And obviously, Magickal Women is still progressing under Usbet and Lucy now, but I can see the legacy of what we achieved in those 5 years, because women have contacted us and said they've now gone on to do higher degrees, or they're doing doctorates, or they're starting writing a book, or they're giving their own talks for the first time. They've set up their own art, or they're doing their own practice and sharing that with others. And I can see some of the people like Emma Catherine, who gave us this marvellous talk about rebel women and rebel magic, about Nanny of the Maroons, the national heroine of Jamaica, an Obeah woman. And Emma herself is an Obeah woman. And at the time, she and I bonded actually over Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, fantastic novel, which features an Obeah woman in it. And I won't talk about Jean Rhys, otherwise we will be here all day. But Emma was writing for various pagan journals and witchcraft and so on the time. And she and I was talking. I know she was talking to a lot of other people, but I remember saying to her, gosh, it's so wonderful that you are. You're thinking perhaps of doing some teaching in the range of Obia, and she was. And I wanted to really encourage her to do that. And it's been marvelous to observe that, we helped her in a way to show that there was such a lot of interest out there in her work. And she did go on and do it. And she's, really rightfully, she's now, you just turn on sort of Facebook and so on, and there's another advertisement where Emma Catherine is doing something with all her colleagues in various settings around on the online world and so on. And Emma is an example of many women who came through Magickal Women who are now doing other things. And every time I see them, or I go into a bookshop and buy one of their books, because I always like to put my money where my support is. I'm really happy that we got to share a sandwich in Kensington, and now they're doing this fabulous thing. So I know that the women have come on and done so much. And, men are nervous, so that's a great outcome, isn't it? And I'm really pleased to know that Ursabet and Lucy are taking Magickal Women in the direction now, new direction, new year, and I wish them every success. I'll always, be one of their biggest supporters, and I know that they're going to have a great deal of an exciting program coming up this year, and certainly into 2024 when the next Magickal Women Conference is in the diary. So I hope people keep an eye on that too.
Wonderful. Well, what a absolutely fabulous story that you've told. You can tell that there is a demand for this, that women are wanting some type of outlet where they can gather, where they can share things, where they can discuss their research, discuss their ideas, discuss their practices, whatever it may be. And with, as you said, no money, basically, you were able to get this up off the ground. So congratulations to you for that. And I had been, of course, following along with what had been, what had been happening over the years. And I was so happy when you reached out to me to talk about this, because I think, yes, this is exactly, I want more women to be on my platform as well, because I think that's important. So congratulations, and thank you for doing that. Very important work.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and I know Esme would say the same too. It is, but yeah.
Right. Well, now you have moved on to a new venture with Owl House Seminars. So could you talk a bit about how this came about and what your goals are with this project?
Yes, with real pleasure. Well, this sort of came about in two ways. One from my actual doctoral work, which I love to share, and there's so much more about that in my own thing. But it flowed from my experiences with Magickal Women, insofar as the online experience where people were engaging was so successful, and I also had a few women come to me, or people come up and say, actually, what I'd really like now is a bit more than a Zoom talk, because I think what we're all used to, isn't it, that there is, the online world is so varied and it's so marvelous, to be honest, in such a short period of time. But there's a little bit of a sense that people want to test it out a bit further, and they want to get more from it themselves. So it's either learning, they get the opportunity to, as you do, to share scholars' work that perhaps the general public would never get to hear about. So that's really interesting and sparks other things from that. And then there's people who want to say, well, how can I get a slice of this? What else is out there? What can I actually do myself? And that's where I thought, well, this is bringing together two things in my own passions here very much. One is the teaching, which I love, and the other is the ability to share new things to people that, very often you won't get outside a university. And in our fields, to be honest, you won't often get them in a university either. So I thought, well, let's just go off piste and do my own thing. So Owl House is a place where, I want imagination lives, and I want people to be able to come in and engage and actually enjoy a seminar. So it's not going to be sitting there thinking, oh my goodness me, lots of academic theory. That is literally the last thing on my agenda. But it is an opportunity for people to hear about text. I mean, literature and the weird, I've chosen this because weird fiction is really interesting anyway, but I am particularly interested. One of my sort of scholarly inquiries is this way on which we gained understanding of different ways of approaching reality. This is the intersection of the paranormal and literature, the occult and literature. What is it telling us, and how can we interrogate it to actually appreciate changes in consciousness? Now, there's a huge amount of work being done in the field now, and thanks to academic trailblazers like Jeffrey Kripal and others, and Diana Pasulka, and whom I've been following for a long time. They're starting now to break through in academia, which is fantastic. And me, in my way, who's been into this thing since I was 10, and I won't tell you how old I am now. I'm not a teenager any longer. So I've been looking at this for 45 odd years, and suddenly there's a confluence of the two things which are able to come together. So I can legitimately, as it were, use my my scholarly approach to work in this and bring it out. I'm very big on making this open access and not scary, but I do think it starts opening up some discussions about how we got here and from where. So I want to take all my learnings into this other sphere and engage and create the welcoming environment that I created with colleagues in Magickal Women. I know that there is this thirst for learning and for knowledge in the generality of the population. And I know that at this point in time, people are starting to question realities, paranormal events. We're just seeing now, aren't we, in culture, and here in February when we're talking, we've had all this big outpouring of interest about the Chinese weather balloons, and are they UFOs, or are UFOs weather balloons, and what knows, and what does it teach? And, there's a great deal of stuff in the general sort of world, if you like. And I thought, well, I want to bring some of my stuff that I love into this public space through Owl House seminars. And so what I'm doing is I'm starting off with introductory here with looking at Moonchild, Aleister Crowley's novel from the 1920s. Well, actually, he wrote it in 1917. So it's really quite an interesting period of time where lots of things are happening politically, socially, magically. And trying to break into this novel using the tarot, because as you know, this is one of the themes within the novel. How does the tarot reading within the novel drive the action? What do we learn about Crowley's sort of magical system, his worldview? How do we start talking about layers of different reality, astral planes, and interaction with non-human entities and so forth? Well, also with the really quite amusing bitchy undercurrent of where he's taking the mick out of the Golden Dawn and his magical sparring partners, shall we call them, in the social context. So it's a very rich book to start from, I think. It's also quite an accessible one, and it plays a lot to themes and interests, which again is in the public domain. We have seen this massive outpouring of people wanting to know about folk horror, for example, and weird fiction generally. And I think if you put the two together, well, you've got Aleister Crowley and Moonchild. That's a pretty darn good place to start.
Indeed.
I've also, one of the things I've done for a long time is tarot, like probably quite a lot of your correspondents. I've taught tarot and I've given tarot readings and I've done all this sort of thing. And I'm very interested in it. and the esoteric nature of the tarot and what it teaches us. So within this particular course that I'm doing, this day course, we're actually going to be looking at the tarot. We're going to be looking at the tarot from what the Golden Dawn was saying about it, how they used it in their magical practice, and how they used it for sort of spiritual and magical development, and how perhaps Crowley might also have adopted it, and what sort of things he was saying about it. Because of course he did his own tarot, the Book of Thoth, later on. So there's a lot there, and I'm hopeful of having some archive materials to share with the students on that day. A bit of tarot practice, a bit of discussion with those who join us who may know the tarot themselves, and really kind of pulling apart, what is the modernist approach to tarot in 1929 when this book was published. So it's that's where I'm starting with that one, and then in May I'm going on to the 1960s, and the course I'm doing then is a deep dive into the course title is Satan Wants Me: Sex, Magic, Sociology in the 1960s. I think there's something for everyone in that, because we're exploring mid-century British counterculture and the occult revival through Robert Irwin's comic novel of the occult, Satan Wants Me, which was published in 1999. This is a fantastic book. It's really funny. There's elements there also of sort of comic horror, and it interweaves a work of an occult lodge and the emerging 1960s academic discipline of sociology, and through the pages of the hero Peter's magical diary. It's a really multi-layered book, and it's very funny. So it's a novel of occult secrets, and Peter is a postgraduate researcher. We know the people very well, don't we, Stephanie? And he's also a bit of a self-conscious hipster, and from the London School of Economics. Now, that's a name literally to conjure with in the 1960s. And simultaneously, he's taking a course of occult study at a wonderful group called the Black Book Lodge in North London, under his tutor, Dr. Felton. And it's a story where through his various diaries, his magical diary, his academic research notes, and other hidden diaries within the novel, that we explore the tensions between British establishment power and the countercultural challenge to this in the mid-20th century. And so we're sort of looking at, well, what's the secret at the heart of the Black Book Lodge then? What's Peter really up to? What's all this with sociology and social change then? Dr. Felton says, through grammar we control the universe, the magician. So what does that mean? What are those implications? And Peter says, LPs are my spirit guides on the journey of life, man. Well, how does he and his friends use new language in new ways to control their new society? And, what's he really up to? And, what's truth? What's reality in this world conjured up by the vision of Satan Wants Me? So we're going to have a bit of fun with that too, looking at the occult revival in the 1960s, looking at London in terms of a magical place. And we're going to look a bit at Robert Irwin's own memoir of his time as a Sufi, in a Sufi madrasa, in his memoir, Memoirs of a Dervish, and identify how he uses other occult novels within it as well, including Aleister Crowley's Moonchild. So we're starting this process through these first two courses. We're going to have magic, mystery, and literary detection, and some humour as well. And there's a sort of links that I'm forming between these that are going to draw into this sort of exploration of British culture and counterculture in particular, but how, what alternative societies, their potency, their attraction, their efficacy, and what do they do, and how do they operate. And then in June, I'm going to be offering a 4-week course where we're really going to deep down into basically the emergence of a British city of counterculture in Glastonbury. Glastonbury is another one of these names to conjure with, and people say, "Oh yes, Glastonbury, how fantastic!" Well, why Glastonbury? Why here? Why then? Why now? What are all these strands within it, and what does it tell us from history, prehistory, myth, magic? It's sort of an evolution both of British phenomenon and British temenos, terroir, magical landscape. And Catherine Maltwood's Temple of the Stars, the Glastonbury Zodiac, was one feature. That really is quite a nice kind of image, really, between using the land, and we traverse it in our consensus reality, but where is it taking us? What is the process of it? Why did she do it then? I've got some interesting thoughts about why I think it evolved at the time it did and emerged when it did. And it's interesting. I want to hear from people who attend the course what they think about the Glastonbury Zodiac and how it works for them. That's a cool that when I did a talk about it for Magickal Women and an online course, and that's something that's very interesting because it does generate a lot of discussion from people who really have their own experiences of these land formations and those who question it, shall we say. And I think it's a really nice sort of metaphor to use for how we interrogate this whole idea of culture and counterculture. But I'm also very big on weirding the middle brow. So taking popular fiction, what dismissively in my mother's day would be called women's books. I mean, heavens above. So Anya Seton, one of my mother's favourites, a great writer of the time, Avalon, she wrote a book which is about Glastonbury, the historical Glastonbury, then the Arthurian legends and so on. And there are many other books as well that by writers like her that have this other dimension that I want us to be able to explore, not only around Glastonbury, but other things. How does her book Green Darkness, for example, bring out the themes of reincarnation, spiritualism, theosophy, all of these other types of what we say alternate spiritualities that were in on the coffee table in so many women's living rooms. So this how for me how this kind of fiction and how this kind of thought is influencing our daily lives, even perhaps without knowing it. So I'm going to be pretty busy at the Owl House.
This sounds absolutely fascinating, and I wish that my own agenda wasn't so full that I could take part in all of these things that you're talking about. I'm really so impressed by the questions that you're asking. I think they're very important ones, and the excellent observations that you are making as well throughout all of this, and the connections that you're making between things. So yeah, I don't know this. How can it get any better than this? I'm asking, So.
Oh, I hope so. Well, the door of the Owl House will be open for quite a long time, Stephanie. So you never know. Our diaries may align at some point.
Great. Yeah.
Well,
at the moment, you are doing PhD research about early 20th century occultism and its influence on modernist literature by women authors. Now, I find this to be so interesting, and I'd like to know if you would share some more about this project and what you're doing with this.
Sure. Yes, happy to. Obviously, it's very much a work in progress, and one always feels a bit sort of crumbs about talking about things which are evolving even as we speak. However, I'm looking at women's empowerment really, and the radical reformation of the interwar family through the feminist occult fiction, the women writers in particular. So I'm looking at 4 women writers between 1900 and 1940. I'm looking at Mary Butts, my gal, Sylvia Townsend Warner, P.L. Travers, and Florence Farr. And I'm analysing the impact of these women's esoteric interests because they all had different esoteric interests. And I'm looking at the impact of these on their fiction and how it contributed to women's personal empowerment and the effects of this on the changing role of the family in the early 20th century. Because as I said, when you see that book on the coffee table, it has this mana, it gives out, it reverberates and ripples into the family circle. And these four writers that I'm looking at, they all share this creative, magical imagination that opens to other realities. This was obviously a theme of mine. And the effect of converse with spirits and extra human entities in their own way. They had their own experience. They all were concerned with marriage and social expectations and, their repudiation of this and open to independence for women through adoption or embracing of unorthodox and transgressive philosophies, which gave women the confidence to say no. So I'm really looking, it's quite a nested thing here. I mean, for example, with Mary Butts, I'm looking at how she used her novel Armed with Madness, which is a retelling of the Grail myth, the Grail legend, and magic. She was an associate of Aleister Crowley for a short period of time, but she was very interested in issues of land and inheritance and so on. And she was also looking for ways that women could reject marriage and the sort of restrictions it put on them. She was very, very at home with fluid sexualities and flexible relationships and so on. And I'm looking at her work from the point of view of how does she present an example of how a modernist family could come together and challenge these norms in this period, and kind of looking at how a grouping that later on might have been called more of a commune, but I'm looking at more of a sort of semi-structured kind of almost medieval family with lots of hangers-on and so on, and how this works in that specific period after the First World War, when the whole of society was beginning to kind of realign itself. And the younger generation, which is the subject of her novel, how they are suddenly saying, well, we've been let down by the older ones, so we're going to work things out for ourselves. We don't think home and family necessarily works anymore, but how do we do this then if we've got to make sure that we've all got this place in society? What's that all about? And magic, and the female current of magic is very, very strong in that novel. And with Sylvia Townsend Warner, I mean, she wasn't a witch as far as we know. There's some nice little hints and subtle sort of suggestions that we can take one way or we can take another in some of her diaries and her papers and so on. I think she was a woman who, like so many of us, really, really, really interested and drawn to folkloric witchcraft and histories and so forth, and the nature of Satan. And in her interpretation, he's woman's best friend, because he's you can throw away all of this sort of restriction that you're living in and form your own way. So she's looking at things from how an older woman, spinster, can achieve her own independence, even in a older age, and cast off all of those shackles of a restrictive family where she's just sort of like an extra unpaid servant, if you will. And Sylvia Townsend Warner really is saying, women are stifled by this establishment, and I'm really looking at what she says about how the middle-brow woman, again, we're with her again, how she can achieve liberation through transgression, because that's a really big step. If you're expected to behave in one way in a family and a society, and you suddenly have an encounter with Satan in the woods, and that results in you having this massive, really powerful feminist speech at the end of the novel that says, no, there's millions of us out there, and one day we're all going to rise up, and you'll know about it. So that's very interesting, because marriage isn't for every woman. Spinsters and lesbians exist, and that's what Sylvia Townsend Warner is saying. And then with Travers, this is very much about the woman as outsider who can effect change, and her own interests, of course, in theosophy and Gurdjieff and later theosophy is very strong. But from this particular angle, I'm looking at how education for children can open their minds and not stifle them. What do we do for the second generation? So what are these women learning for themselves, and how are they actually teaching the children to do it? And with Mary Poppins, fantastic. I get to revel in all of the Mary Poppins books, reeling them all out, the ones I had from the early 1960s when I was a child. I knew their day would come again. It's wonderful to be able to look at them with this narrative in mind, that it's about inverting reality. It's about turning the society upside down. Children love it because of an adult saying, oh my goodness, you can have your cake before you have your bread and butter if you want to. But it's much deeper than just that, of course. And it's saying, well, if you actually go with this, you don't have to live within these constructions of society that we put on you. Don't have to stifle you, no matter how you develop in time. You have this as a starting point, that don't accept what you're given, question. And I think that is a really powerful thing to say to a child. There are ways of behaving that you can protect yourself and you can, have a good life, but actually never settle for less, which is, use it. Listen to the magical woman who is your governess, your nanny. She will guide you. And I think this is really, Travers also, interestingly, in her work, she proposes the power of mythic figures for women's empowerment as well. And I'm just beginning to look at what she's saying about how modern women can have appeal to the figures of the goddesses, and from myth and legend, and also from fairy tales. So there's some very interesting things within that. And then, of course, just moving my notes, so I don't forget to mention darling Florence Farr, who, of course, was the managing director, effectively, of the Golden Dawn. And with her work, I'm looking at both her journalism on her sort of suffragist way of encouraging women's independence, but also their own empowerment, and how does the magical world that she inhabited and the magical imagination translate into empowering women to live their own independent lives successfully, and what does that mean for how they will then construct the family? What is the role of what's the effect, that rippling effect of that book on the coffee table when you are actually a magician of high standing? Where do we go with all this? What does the astral plane how does that have that effect in your life? So that I will be looking at Florence Farr a little later on this year. But the four together, I think I'm approaching this in terms of how they address the same kind of questions about women's life and what their work reveals from very slightly different perspectives, but they're all looking at it from a kind of enchanted worldview, from a countercultural perspective, before that phrase was really common. Yeah. And also very much, they all had their own challenges and struggles with independence. As individuals, but then also with these interests in alternative spiritualities as well. If you're chucking out, going to the church 3 times a day on a Sunday in the 1920s, you've got to have a darn good reason or an argument as to why you're doing it very often. And I think, that this opens up a lot of interesting discussion around that whole subject. So, there's so much more I could talk about with Mary Butts and so on, but I think I probably should draw to a close at that point.
Well, I love the sound of this, and I know that you said it's a work in progress, but I can hardly wait to read the result of this, because this, this is right up my alley. I just love this type of conversation. So wonderful. Okay, so next to all of this that you're doing, you're also doing some other research and writing about Alan Garner, who is an English novelist that is considered to be like a children's writer, but he didn't like that label that was put upon him. Am I correct about that?
Right.
Okay. Yes. For those who might not know who he is, could you explain a bit about his background and why you're researching him?
Oh, yes, I with great pleasure. Yes. Well, Alan Garner for me is kind of almost where it all started, right? Alan Garner is a writer of fantasy fiction. He does refuse the title children, and that is just the publisher's shorthand, if you will. He is a writer who lives in Cheshire. He's from Cheshire in the northwest of England, and he grounds all his fiction in and around about 20 to 30 miles of where he was born. There's one sole example, which is a novel called Strandloper, which partly takes place in Cheshire and partly amongst the Aboriginal community in Australia in the 19th century or 18th century. However, his early books, The Weird Stone of Brisingamen and then The Moon of Gomrath, and those two are about two children who go to live with their guardians in Cheshire in the sort of early 60s, late 50s, and they get involved with exciting battles of good and evil amongst the roaming around the children, the Cheshire countryside, whilst they're kind of protecting these bracelets and power objects, shall we say, from the forces of evil that would take them in. So I was sort of started off from that. Now, what was really so interesting about Alan Garner's work, particularly in the Moon of Gomrath, the second book, which he wrote right at the beginning of the 60s, he writes about things which later in the 60s became very important in the countercultural world. For example, he talks about the Old Straight Track, Alfred Watkins's work from the 1920s about ancient trackways, which have become called ley lines, have become known as ley lines later.
Okay.
But that's a very short and not entirely full account of it. But my interest in Garner was then, okay, so this is really interesting. He's introducing these ideas about stars, constellations, and deep earth, and these powerful figures. One of his most famous books that has been made into television programs and films and things is The Owl Service, Owl Service, and about which is a reenactment of in one layer is a reenactment of a Welsh story from the Mabinogion, and so it brings in all sorts of resonances with myth. And the Mabinogion, it sounds terribly Poe, but that is one of the books that we had in our house. My father was academic, and one of the things he liked was Malta. He's Welsh, so therefore that was quite useful. So I thought, this is very interesting. But so Garner is using both ancient myth and he's using unusual things to sort of tell a story about the world isn't quite what it seems. It is actually much more. His work is much more than a simple kind of cops and robbers in the tunnels underneath Alderley Edge. It begins to be something that's telling us something about realities, about cosmology, about the nature of time, about the nature of death, about interactions with paranormal entities, and the effect that these have on people in our consensus reality. What's particularly interesting for me is the fact that he starts off using. Obviously, he's writing in his first books about children and adolescents. And when we move on to his third book, so we have Weird Stone of Brisingamen, Moon of Gomrath, then we go to Elidor, which is the one I'm going to talk about, and then the Owl Stories. And Elidor is the one that is set in Manchester, and I live in Manchester, so it's very interesting. I've been on a hunt for the sites. They're all underground now because they're all box of flats, however. So he's writing about the world in transition, because he's writing again here in the early 60s when we had in Britain huge upheavals in social formations of our towns and cities, slum clearance, demolition, post-war reconstruction, bomb sites, all of this. And he places this mysterious, mythic kind of resonance and interaction between children and this other world of Elidor and their place in it. And they have all sorts, where they have almost like the Grail Hallows, they've all got these transitional objects they have to hold onto. And the relationship in the message, one of the messages, if there is a message in his work here, is the effect that we have in our world is it affects the other world, and vice versa. So he's creating this image of a multi-layered universe where all things happen at the same time, which is something certainly that in another part of the forest over here is part of this new work of consciousness and experience of reality that is so interesting. So anyway, back to the story. The whole Garner's work has kind of had similar themes and has similar settings, but as he goes back and forth in time around the same area. He's written many books over time. I should know the number off by heart, shouldn't I? But in the present moment, and he's really exploring what it is to experience time in this shifting kind of universe, and the relationship between, shall we say, deep time and the cosmos and current time and the actions that we take within it. There's also what I see very much as a nice kind of radical English radicalism that informs some of this about the political change. Garner's very clear. He says he's not a realist. He thinks realism is boring. He's got millions of universes to play with. Why should he feel about realism, for heaven's sake? So he's talking about different ways in which he's still talking about how politics and inheritance and political actions affect people's lives. Landowners aren't your friend. You lose your place, you get evicted from your house, that can change your family's life for generations. And in this context of a fairly well-defined small kind of community, if you like, in terms of the 30-mile round radius or whatever it is, you can see these themes playing out. And so it's a way of understanding how we know our things. And I think for me, his work, what's so interesting about his work is that where it may have been originally described and sold as children's literature, and a lot of people say poo-poo the first one time, oh gosh, it's so this, so that. I think, yeah, but if you consider it now looking back from 1960 to 1920, so 2023, going back in time myself there, you can see his work has changed so much, although the settings have remained fairly similar. So you can see it because his latest one, Treacle Walker, really does show us a multi-layered universe and time and space and different cosmology. See, one of the things that's so interesting about him is that he lives in this really old house. He and his wife live in this really old house called Toad Hall, and a black and white, cottage, but it overlooks Jodrell Bank. And when he first saw it there in 1957 or whatever, he said, "I found the only place I'm ever going to live my whole life." Well, that keeps the estate agent's bills down. That's quite nice over a lifetime. But it's also really, I can imagine that at some deep level, he suddenly went, right, that's it. There's this fantastic juxtaposition between those two things. And then later, as he's spoken in various interviews and so on, he's got friends who are astrophysicists at Jodrell Bank and so on. And so his life, his own influences, if you will, is not only ancient myth and local legend, but it's this cosmological thing, modern astrophysical thing, which weaves in so interestingly. Now, I'm seeing other things in Treacle Walker than, because that's just my way, that may be a bit outside this. And I'm really wanting to get into to exploring some of these later works of his mature fiction, because this is not a children's book, Treacle Walker. I mean, Alan Garner himself is well over 80 now. And interestingly, he was born... He's born the same year as my own late father, which has always been an interesting thing to me, because I can see their experiences are quite similar. So over that period of time, how society in this country has changed so greatly from the expectations, and Garner's fiction has weaved in and out of it all, as I see it. And now he is in older age. A lot of the things he's talking about do directly, of course, address matters of, well, what do we mean then? What is death? Do we die? What about this alternate reality business? And what about this multi-layered universe and with everything happening simultaneously? And so when I was reading both the latest, sounds awfully Poe, doesn't it? It was over the dinner table. I was reading the latest Pal and Treacle Walker at the same time. And I thought, that's so interesting. You know, I've got all this stuff buzzing around my head now. And I go away and sort of, you know, read the paper or something, a bit of light relief. But I think it's definitely literature and the weird. Once you get to this level, you know, it's much more than than, as I say, a sort of cops and robbers underground thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to understand the first book in order, as I argued, to actually get to grips with the last one. So this project, you're going to laugh at this. I've been working on this since 1982, when I was not 81 actually. When I was a student doing my BA, I wanted to do my dissertation on Alan Garner's work, because I said, oh my gosh, he's talking about all this weird stuff. You have to imagine this is me at the age of sort of, oh, this is a witchcraft. The world. Oh, this is so interesting. And of course, in those days, it's unbelievable now to the industry. Children's literature was not something you studied. And I remember going to the tutor and saying, do you think I could? Oh, well, you know, well, okay. Well, somebody might be able to do that. So old so-and-so, you know, Professor Jimmy, he might be interested in helping you with that. But, you know, unfortunately, he's not here today. And then you've got to get your title in by 4:00. So think again. So anyway, Alan Garner's loss was Jean Rhys's gain at that point. But I started working on it then. And it's kind of what's always been in the background for me. As I said, it formed a great deal of what I do and how I am. And at the same time, I think it's, in any event, take me out of the equation. I think Alan Garner is such a rich writer. He's not a writer that I think that is easily put in a box and, you know, that's it. Oh, he was great in the 60s, but, or, you know, oh, yes, well, if you're 13, you'll love this one, but you'll never read it again.
Yeah.
And there's something for him to, I mean, it's a shame he didn't win the Booker, but there you go. He will always win the Booker in my heart. So that's the end of that. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't quite know how I got onto that. Yeah. So that is seriously another project of mine that is going perforce a little slower, but it is going to evolve. It is evolving, and it is going to result in a book. There's one good critical work of Alan Garner that was written by Neil Phillip, and it was published in 1981. I found that in the University Library Polytechnic Library when I was doing it. I thought, oh God, what is the point? If somebody else has written it already, bloke. But anyway, it was something totally different. But nobody else has sort of really taken up the mantle since. Neil Phillip's still writing, still doing brilliant things, excellent. Lots of people have written lots of articles. But I thought, well, you know, time to put up or shut up, girl. You've been talking about this for long enough. I think if you're going to do it, it's a book. You've jolly well got to do it. So kind of that's where I am. In fact, I'm definitely where I am right now.
Yeah.
It is working on that as a side project in this dodecahedron of so many sides that is my life. It's there. So watch this space for that, but it will happen.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. It sounds super interesting. And I have to confess, I have not read anything by Alan Garner, but your storytelling abilities about what his stories are about are really inspiring me to really look into that and check him out, because this sounds I wonder, I mean, this sounds like a C.S. Lewis type of thing with children and adventures and things, and I'm like, why? You know, I of course grew up in the United States, so but even C.S. Lewis was a popular writer that I read as a child, and I still read from time to time. And I'm wondering why Alan Garner doesn't have that same reputation, I guess.
I think that's an interesting question, and I think it is a bit twofold. I did like C.S. Lewis up to a point when I was a a child. I think most of us did. I'll be fair. The interesting thing between the Garner and Lewis kind of conundrum is I think twofold. One, in some parts of Garner's world, he is very specific. He does use in the early work sort of, his interpretation of Cheshire dialect and so on, so it can be a little bit resistant to first readings. I mean, especially if you're in, the South like I was. Well, actually, in the first books, we lived in Yorkshire, so that's one reason why I was so happy. Oh, great. And the heroine's called Susan. You can't say fairer than that. Wow, tick. The serious point. C.S. Lewis is writing with a Christian viewpoint.
Right.
Garner emphatically is not. And coming from a Christian family, I used to pretend to be asleep so I could avoid church. The fact that Garner didn't do this, and he doesn't in any way sort of go down that route of saying that church is the way to be, or Christianity is the way to be, it makes him a very interesting writer. And I can imagine that in some contexts that's sort of, it's a bit weird, we won't bother with him. The other thing about Garner as well, and particularly in The Moon of Gomrath, he actually does use extracts from grimoires, which, of course, well, goodness me, when I was 8, wow, so fantastic. Actually, I was a little bit older than 8, but still. And he says in the back, yes, these books really exist in the British Library if you want to. I've just not put the full text in, just in case.
Yeah.
So, I mean, within the actual physical bounds of the book, you've got this kind of invocation of magic demons from grimoires that perhaps if you were a teacher in certain schools you might look at and say, oh my goodness, no, we're not having that. Though interestingly, it was our school teacher that first read them to the class. That's why I have it. So thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Martin, because otherwise I might not have read any of them. So that's the serious thing, is that there is that difference and foundation. And I think that Garner in the past, in the sort of 70s, he was interviewed and he was very disparaging, I have to say. I'm censoring what it said. Very disparaging about Lewis. He didn't think that, for various reasons. He softened his comments about him in more recent interviews. But I think the fundamental is there that he sees it, and someone like Philip Pullman also takes this view. With Lewis, he's very kind of almost hectoring and didactic and insistent that there is this thing, Aslan is God, and that's good. Yeah. Whereas, Will Pullman's position certainly isn't that, and Garner's equally is not. And I think Garner, C.S. Lewis fans and scholars will probably, disagree with me with this, but I think Garner is probably or possibly going in a sort of a more of a kind of darker vein with this grimoire thing and the sexual myths of that he draws on from the Mabinogion and things of that nature. And there is actually quite a lot of sex in Garner's work, which again, when I was a student, I thought, oh, heavens, this is so interesting. He's talking about menstruation. Oh, and who else was? Very few. Yeah. And it's pretty, you've got to kind of know what you're looking for, but it is definitely there. And I don't think we see it quite so much in Lewis. I think, the Susan in Lewis doesn't come out quite so well. We're thinking, oh, actually, I do quite like lipstick, thank you. So that's boo hit. But that's the ones that is the criticism that you hear from over and over again. Comes out of it not very well. So that we have to allow Lewis other a run at things as well. He's part of the Inklings. Knew Charles Williams, so he did know a fair few things about magic and what have you. But at the same time, I can't quite forgive him his views on tights. So, there are other there are reasons why I prefer Garner. But I mean, at the end of the day, I won't decry Lewis's influence within this whole sphere, because it's silly. We have to kind of move on with all of that. But it's a very long-winded way of saying that I wouldn't be at all surprised why some schools say, yes, Lewis, and we're not even going to open that one. Thank you very much, Garner.
Well, such a obvious. Now I'm kind of like, wanting to hit myself on the head, like, well, of course, stupid. I grew up in the Bible Belt in the United States. So, I mean, if this makes perfect sense. I mean, you would never even see that in a school. I even went to a parochial school. So, I mean, you wouldn't see that. And you wouldn't see it in any bookstores, I would guess. I mean, I don't recall ever seeing the name Alan Garner. And I was an avid reader as a child. I was always, lurking around bookstores and, spending all of my extra time. Whenever I had extra time, I'd spend my time there and, looking at everything because I was very curious. I just didn't spend time in one particular area of the bookstore. And I don't recall ever coming across this author. So I think you probably hit the nail on the head with why he was.
I think so, but I mean, I think at that time also there was quite a lot of books that didn't necessarily cross over quite so. I mean, I can think of another author whom I love very much, who's John Gordon. His House on the Brink and the Giant Beneath the Snow, and loads of them, Ghost Under the Hill, and so on. Now, John Gordon, he was a writer very much for the sort of similar age group, if you will, to start with. But he's an author who was very influenced by M.R. James, and a lot of his work. I love it. I mean, it's really interesting. And, when I do my weird children's class, he will be in it, believe me. But he uses very much those. And again, with him, he's based in Norfolk, and a lot of his work is around Norfolk. I think he's probably died by now. The last time I saw an interview with him, he was well over 80 at the time. It was a while back. I hope not. But anyway, but similarly, I think potentially he may have a very English kind of or British kind of appeal, and so much of those 60s things as well depends purely, doesn't it, on the publishing business at the time. Yeah. Right. I know that Garner has been published in the States, but I'm quite prepared. I quite accept the fact that he won't be anywhere. I mean, I can imagine there's quite a lot of people who buy his books in New York or somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is region affected by the region of where you're living. But
interestingly, having said that, I must just say, I mean, I went to Alderley Edge last year down there. I was poking about in a shop, and I got a copy of Moon of Gonrath, which is up here on the shelf. Another one. I've only got the 10. I don't know. Anyway, I found this edition, and I was talking to the lady in the charity shop, and I said, "Oh," she said, "Oh, who's that then?" I said, "Oh, local author Alan Garner." She said, "Who?" I thought, oh God, you're older than me and you've lived here all your life and you don't know. Here I come, just moved to the area, and I'm Gordon Bennett. So I mean, not absolutely first. However, when my book comes out, there will be no reason why people shouldn't know about it.
Exactly. And I am very much looking forward to reading that book when it comes out. And in the meantime, I'll read Alan Garner's work.
Yes.
And I hope that other people, the listeners and the viewers out there, are also inspired by what you're talking about here, and the ideas that you're sharing, and that they'll start looking into this as well if they hadn't heard about it, like me, like myself. So, and as well, if others are interested in finding out more about what you're doing, they can visit your website called SueTerryAcademic.com. I'll include the link in the program notes, where they can find out about everything you're doing, about all of the Owl House seminars, the schedules, and a plethora of other information, all the other things that you're doing as well. And I'll include all of the links, of course, including Magickal Women, because they're still going strong too. And so I would just really like to thank you for coming on today to share all of this. You have a wealth of information and knowledge, and I feel so privileged to be able to talk with you today. So thank you for sharing all of this.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I know I do kind of run with it when I get going. But thank you so much.
I love it. And best of luck to you with your endeavors.
Thank you so much. I'll let you know how it goes.
Great.